I'm Coralie Kenny. My occupation is that I'm a financial services lawyer and I currently work for the Suncorp Group. And I'm also not feeling very well, so I apologise if I cough. And I'm the currently the Treasurer of the Law Society of New South Wales.
Do you wish to make an opening statement?
And I'm the Chair of the Corporate Lawyers Committee at the moment. Well, we're here to talk about client needs and expectations, as you know. And when it comes to corporate lawyers, which I would prefer to refer to as in-house, in-house, as probably aware from the statistics, is actually the largest growing segment of the profession. It's sitting at about just under 20% in our practicing certificate records, although there are a lot of people who practice in-house with either full certificates or until fairly recently, until now even, they don't need to have certificates. So according to the other statistics that are around, it could be as many as 25 or 30% of the profession. The thing about in-house lawyers is that their client, or their major client, is the entity that they work for, which means that they've got a lot more ability to understand the business needs. So the future of in-house legal practice, as far as the committee that I chair and my own experience and my colleagues' experience, really is that it all aligns to the needs of the client that you're working for. So there's a range of in-house lawyers. Some work for small organisations, some work for very large organisations. My personal experience is mainly in large financial services organisations and global financial services organisations. So I sort of will make these comments from what I call the big end of town, as opposed to perhaps in-house lawyers who work for small companies where there may be a sole lawyer or they may not be quite at the forefront of activities that some of the large corporates are. With the clients that I work for, at the moment and since the global financial crisis, it's all about cost cutting. You know, they're expanding their businesses to be customer focused. They might be going into globalisation. They might be, if they're a trader, moving to real-time time zone movements in investment transactions. But at the end of the day, it's all about cost cutting and it's all about control of costs. And the thing about having lawyers practising in-house is that you can control the costs of the legal work and the legal spend that you do. Whereas if you, in the old days, like 30 years ago, the in-house lawyer would often be like the post box. They'd do a little bit of work, and every time anything of substance came along, they'd farm it out to the external law firms. These days, increasingly, the skill sets of the people that are working in-house are far more sophisticated. There's very rarely, in my organisation, we do have panels for things like I won't be talking about the people that do the dispute resolutions, all the claims and insurance and things like that, but for what I'd call corporate work, investment work, superannuation, life insurance, for example, I work in as well, we actually don't need to go out to the external law firms unless we absolutely have to, and that might be because we haven't got capacity for some reason. It might be because there's a particularly nuanced area that we don't really know as much about as somebody else does. Or sometimes it's simply because the board or the business, that part of the business you're working for, may need comfort that what you're telling them is actually okay, or that somebody else has thought about it as well, and they like to get that extra form of comfort. So at my organisation particularly, over the last couple of years, we've increasingly become sophisticated with the use of systems to monitor the external legal spend, and I think there's somebody coming next week to talk to you about that. And as I said, it's all about going back to the organisation being able to control. And that doesn't just apply in the way they spend money on legal. It also applies in the case, for example, of claims in general insurance, making sure, they all have the spare parts people lined up and the people who are going to come and fix your plumbing lined up. It's all about controlling it, because if you can control it, you can control the cost, and then you can control the profit. So that's the way it works in large organisations anyway. It does come down again, we talked before about unbundling legal activities, legal functions, which you can do with an in-house team. It's a bit more difficult to do if there's only one of you. But lawyers are also in-house increasingly becoming involved with commercial activities. And the reason for that is because you get a very deep knowledge of the business by working in-house, particularly with some of the structures now where I actually sit with the area of the business that I look after. And as a consequence, you develop very strong skills, and you also become involved in activities and decisions that are not necessarily just legal. But as a consequence of that, when you do your legal stuff, you're able to add value far more quickly and at a far greater cost of profit to them. There's a lot of cross-skilling goes on too. They call this they also have the dial-up, dial-down. You know, they say, well, you know, if we've got people over here, we can move over there if we need them for a project and then back again. So there's a lot of which is very typical large organisations. They're always doing those sort of things, even amongst the business, not just amongst legal. We also, of course, use secondees and contractors. And the other thing about legal in-house at the moment is that there's a move to, I think, which is fabulous in my view, to recognise our skills as risk mitigators. My general counsel has just taken over the whole risk function and the compliance function. I know the fellow at Commonwealth Bank's moved to run risk because as lawyers, particularly when you work in a business, you have a very good nous for forward thinking. I mean, you know, accountants spend their lives looking at figures that are evidence of past activities, and then they might put a hat on and try and forecast, but we spend our time thinking about what could happen, what could go wrong, how something needs to be done, and making sure we mitigate and get things doing properly. And the best bit about being a lawyer in-house really is when when nothing goes wrong, and they think, oh, you know, well, you weren't much use there, and you think, actually, I was a lot of use, because without me, it could have been very bad. So far as I said, going forward in the future, their expectations and needs, I think it will very much align with what the clients and what the big, in my case, what the big companies are doing, and that flows down to the small ones as well.
What impact do you think? Thank you for that. Well, what impact do you think in-house counsel are having on the private profession, and the way the private profession delivers services?
I think the private profession that we use, and we tend to use big large law firms only. Finding they have to be more focused, and they really need to be able to add value. Of course, we would prefer not to pay them as much as they would often quote, but on the other hand, we can. So, depending on who you use, I tend to use people externally who I know have a reputation for a particular skill set. It's not like the old days where everything went out, but also the other thing is that in the vast majority of the legal work that Suncorp does, a couple of years ago, before we did our panel rationalisation, I think Suncorp had something like 165 external law firms that they used to use, because Suncorp grew by buying other businesses. And, you know, people would appoint the local friend, the local lawyer to do, I suppose it was personal injury, you know, insurance claims and things like that. We've reduced that down to about 40-something on the panel now, and I think it's even coming down to 20-something in the fairly near future. And that's very monitored with a very sophisticated system, and the fellow will be coming next week to talk about that. So I suppose what it is that our client is the same client as private practice clients, because our client is the company. If we need help in doing the work, we get external lawyers to help us. As I said, the more internal lawyers there are and the more sophisticated their skills are, which the client wants, because then they can control how much they spend, that will invariably mean that there would be less going out. And because what goes out is not within the same level of a range of control, which is why internal law firms, internal practices like ours are now putting more controls around what they're getting from external, because the client's demanding it. It's those bloody bean counters are up there, you know. It's all about control of costs.
Do you think the growth of in-house counsel has plateaued, or that more and more we're going to see corporations employing their own in-house lawyers?
I think it'll come to an equilibrium point, because it's a bit like they employ their own accountants. you know, years ago you would have had a couple of accountants inside an organisation, and then they would have used one of the larger firms to do a lot of their actual accounting stuff. Now they have teams inside. But the interesting thing about accounting, of course, because it's global, universal, just everybody speaks the same language wherever they are in numbers, that's all going, a lot of it's going offshore too. So, you know, the finance functions are often done in India or in the Philippines or somewhere like that. I don't know that with legal, particularly in Australia in the area I work, which is financial services, that they'll be able to do that, because it really is a very sophisticated and esoteric regulatory regime that we have here. But, you know, at some point in the future, there are regimes coming in globally, as you know. I mean, privacy came in around the world. It's much the same everywhere around the world that has privacy regime, anti-money laundering. Not so much the same when it comes to the way we regulate perhaps our banks or our insurance companies. But when things start to become very global, you can use skill sets from other jurisdictions to help you out. But I think it'll plateau, because there'll come a point where there's no point in putting any more on, because you're not going to save yourself any more money, I think, yeah.
Is it likely to reduce in the future if you're outsourcing into IT and technology?
Well, possibly, yes. I know that someone said to me when I first started practising in-house, oh, you know, it's always swings and roundabouts. For a few years they'll have a big in-house team, and then a few years later they'll cut it and they'll start to use external. But I don't think that's the case so much anymore. I mean, one of the things that's really happened since the global financial crisis, particularly in financial services, is there has been a real concentration on cutting out excess fat and making sure everything works really efficiently. And that's the point where, as I said, you pick the lawyers that you need with the right skill sets. Well, we hope they do. We're having a restructure at the moment. I might even be there in another month for all I know. I might be too old for them by then. But, you know, you pick it and there's an equilibrium with that. So I would doubt it in the sort of work that we do, because at the moment what is outsourced locally. Yeah.
You mentioned that you use large firms predominantly. Do you see a change in the way they deliver services to you as a result of these changing sort of expectations?
I think so.
And the way they charge as well?
Yeah. When I worked in private practice, it was a while ago now, and even a few years back, you know, you would give a law firm a matter, and they would take it and they would run with it. It doesn't work like that really anymore. What happens is that the in-house practitioner takes the matter, runs with it, and when they need input on particular aspects of it, they go to the external law firm and they get input. And, you know, the business is very interesting, because they'll say, oh, these external people, all they do is couch their advice in disclaimers as to why they're not going to be liable for this and liable for that. And of course, you are putting that in your letters of advice if you're an external firm, because you're not running the whole thing. You haven't got your fingers in every part of the pie, and so you can't be absolutely sure that every part of the pie is as you would have had it if you had done it yourself. So it's quite different to the way it used to operate a few years back, I think, for the sort of work I do.
And what about certainty of costs? You talked a bit about needing to manage costs, understandably.
Yeah, we do.
And are you seeing that change with law firms as well?
I think the benefit of working in-house and having a true technical skill set and being able to do something yourself, except you know that you want to get someone else to do it, is that you sort of know how long it would take to do, and therefore how much it should cost. So when somebody comes in and estimates that it'd cost 4 or 5 times what you know it will take to read and to understand if you were doing it, being generous, you know, you can have a few words to say about things like that. And we have this payment system run through India, as everything is, where you have to put in the estimate, and then if the estimate changes, if it goes up, you've got to make sure you go into the system, and because when you come to pay the bill, they won't pay the bill unless it actually reconciles with the estimate.
The computer won't let you pay the
bill. Well, Indian computer won't let you pay. And the consequence of that really for the externals, unfortunately, is that whereas perhaps a couple of years ago, bills to an organisation like mine might have been paid fairly quickly, like within a couple of weeks. Now it can take quite a long time. And it's not because we don't want to pay, it's because the system you've got to go through all of which is designed to make things more efficient and so that the records for finance purposes are sort of spot on, and that everything's been approved effectively before the work's done. So it's like a procurement type arrangement. But it does take a lot longer to actually process, unfortunately.
Have you noticed any change in the way legal firms provide their services? Are they pushing the work down to more junior lawyers, or are they, is the work being done by the more experienced lawyers within organisations?
I still find that the work that I send out is still done by associates usually, but that's because it's fairly sophisticated associates and partners. The panel that we have that does dispute resolution, so they're all the claims and things that the fellow will be speaking about next week, I don't know what they do. I would imagine that wouldn't be done by partners, that would be done by solicitor practitioners in their firms.
And are corporations conscious of whether or not any of that work is outsourced, or that's not a concern?
No, well, I don't know. You might speak next week to my colleague who's coming, because he actually, as I said, he monitors and manages that panel. Certainly with the work I do, they wouldn't be outsourcing it. I'm outsourcing it to them, so they don't outsource any further. I don't do the sort of work that needs that sort of stuff. Yeah.
No.
Any more questions?
Just you mentioned using secondees and contractors often. When would you choose to use a secondee or a contractor or an external law firm? Like, what would you be?
Sometimes we've got a project that's going on and we need an extra resource, or we're down a staff member. So we would get secondees. Most of our secondees come in from the large law firms that we have on our panel. So we'll get people from Minters or Freehills or Mallisons or Cores will come in. For us, they usually come in for periods of a few months, and it's usually to do often to do a particular task, because or where there's a gap in resourcing for some reason. Yep.
Thank you very much for coming along.
That's all right. It's a pleasure.